If Russia suffered a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield, if it suffered something similar to the autumn of 2022, where a Ukrainian counteroffensive suddenly liberated all of a region, let's say all of the Donetsk region, including moving into Donetsk city, which has been the center of the Russian occupation since 2014 in eastern Ukraine, then yes, a sudden collapse on the battlefield does herald the end not only of Putin, but of the Russian system as we currently know it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're looking at the position of Vladimir Putin and how, if he were to lose power, that might come about. Joining me to discuss it, delighted to be joined by Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, welcome back to Frontline.
James, it's great to be here. Thanks to you and your viewers.
There seems to be a general acceptance at the moment that the war in Ukraine has reached some kind of stalemate. How do you think Vladimir Putin will be viewing the war at the moment?
Well, before we get to Vladimir Putin viewing it, I'm going to kick back against that in terms of this word stalemate they keep circulating through. Um, okay, let's say, first of all, yeah, there has not been much movement on the front lines in recent months, despite Ukraine launching a counteroffensive back in June. But Ukraine has gained territory in the east of the country, in the Donetsk region. They have gained territory in the south of the country significantly this week. They have established for the first time an area on the east bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region in the south. So it's a gradual advance. It is coming against built up Russian defenses that have been developed over months. It has been not the breakthrough that I think a lot of people sort of hyped it up as, but that's not how war often proceeds. Secondly, I think we need to think about where we are before declaring a stalemate. Let's think back, almost 21 months ago at the start of the invasion in February 2022. Vladimir Putin and his inner circle expected they would be in control of Kyiv within days, that the Ukraine government would collapse, that they would capture, possibly kill President Zelensky and his ministers and install a puppet government. Didn't happen. By April 2022, Russia had been defeated in the sense that it withdrew from northern Ukraine. You then have Vladimir Putin's food war in the summer of 2022 to try to starve out, break food supplies by shutting down Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea. Didn't succeed. Ukraine continued to hold up, to maintain its economy despite the pressure. And indeed, in the autumn of 2022, you had this significant counteroffensive that liberated much of northeast Ukraine and parts of the south, whether it be in the Kharkiv region or whether it be Kherson city. Then you have Vladimir Putin launching his energy war to try to break the Ukrainian will by freezing them, by freezing people who support Ukraine. Didn't work. They held out despite half the energy grid being knocked out at one point. So before we get to talking about stalemate here, let's just stop for a minute and realize what a significant defeat Russia has already taken in terms of the initial objectives of the Kremlin, which were to conquer its neighbor, to get rid of the government, to install its own regime, and to show the West, you're divided. NATO is ineffective. Europe's ineffective. The US is ineffective. The international community is ineffective. So let's talk about then the third area, which is not about the past, but where we go in the future. When you hear this word stalemate, quite often it's just referring just to the military front lines at this point. And you could look at the front lines where the Russians are trying to take the town of Avdiivka to give Putin some type of victory. This is a town in the Donetsk region in the east, just as they took Bakhmut back in May. You can look at Ukraine, as I said, not moving, by leaps and bounds, but by moving by, a few kilometers. But that's not what war is. War is also the political, the diplomatic, the economic side of what is taking place. And the leaders who know what's going on, both in Ukraine and beyond this, realize this is a marathon, not a sprint. This war goes into 2024. It will continue to rely upon additional military aid being given to Ukraine. Look for the F-16s to be delivered in the spring of 2024. Look for an uptick in the amount of armored vehicles that will be delivered over the next year. Look at trying to offset Russia's advantage, its main advantage right now, which is in artillery shells, by trying to provide more for Ukraine. But then look at the economic side of this. This was never an economic war, which was the idea of breaking Russia at the very start. That's not what sanctions were meant to do. Sanctions were meant to limit Russia's war ability and then to constrict it gradually. Now that is happening. The Russians are under a great deal of pressure. Let's talk about the diplomatic front. It is about reinforcing, building up NATO, not just for the sake of Ukraine, but for the sake of Europe. So you have Finland in NATO. You have Sweden, which I think will join fairly soon once the Turkish president, Recep Erdogan, stops posturing. And you're also talking about what is going to be the expansion of the European Union. Not with actual membership for Ukraine or its neighbor Moldova immediately, but we're on the way to membership. Those discussions, those negotiations, in fact, will take place within days in terms of laying out the path, the 7 conditions that are there for Ukraine to meet. So, an expanded EU, an expanded NATO, albeit at a great deal of cost and resource, but a defeat of Russia. It's just going to be the case that we're looking at the longer arc of history rather than anything being resolved by Christmas of 2023.
And maybe it speaks to Putin's underlying weakness that whereas when he started this full-scale invasion, he will have been hoping for quite a quick victory. Now, maybe, I don't know if you agree with this, Scott, maybe his best tactic is to play the long game and his final hope is to hope for a change in administration in the White House.
That's exactly what is happening in terms of the long game with Vladimir Putin, because his immediate game was to claim a legacy in 2022. If you're trying to read Putin, and you've got smarter minds who've been on with you on frontline who've done this,
Not many.
but if you're trying to, well, Mark Galeotti was just on, and I'm going to defer to Mark at any point, right? But if you try to read Putin, the man's 71 years old. He's been in power for more than 20 years at the top of the Russian system. All right, what's his legacy he's going to hand over? His legacy is going to be greater Russia. He's going to, Russia has actually seized part of Ukraine back in 2014. In a sense, they've waged war on Ukraine since 2014, but now he's going to make it visible. They're going to dominate the entire country. Quite clearly, that doesn't work. And so it's like, well, where's Putin's next step? Well, what he does in the autumn of 2022 is he says, all right, I'm going to annex these 4 Ukrainian regions. So we've already got Crimea in the south. We will formally annex Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south. We'll annex Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. But Russia doesn't occupy all of those 4 regions. Indeed, they've lost territory in 3 of those 4 regions, significantly in Kherson, but also in Zaporizhia and Donetsk. So how can you annex regions if you haven't been able to militarily make them submit? So now the question is, all right, well, where can he claim his victory? Well, he still has parts of those regions. And what we move from the military conflict, from the food conflict to the energy conflict to the psychological conflict. And it's not the psychological conflict to break Ukraine. I think Ukraine's in it for the long haul. It is to break countries around Ukraine. So Putin plays the idea, both through his own propagandist and from those who, whether they are actually working for the Kremlin or quite happy to put out Kremlin lines in other countries, saying it's too expensive for you. It's too costly. You're just sending, you're just going to continue to waste your resources. Why don't you concentrate on your own countries? So Vladimir Putin's biggest hope right now, his biggest hope might be a guy named Donald Trump. Think back to 2016, when Russia, which had launched an all-out psychological war after its setback in Ukraine in early 2014. It lost the pro-Russian leader, Viktor Yanukovych, because of the Maidan Revolution, the popular uprising. It was on the back foot because Ukraine might move closer to the EU, to NATO, so they seized Crimea, and then they launched this psychological war. All types of information operations, whether it be RT, Sputnik, the Insider, Duran, and the interference through social media, through allies in the elections of other countries, including the US and a guy named Donald Trump. And no, it's not a fiction. It's not Trumpgate. It is an actual fact that Russia interfered in the US elections, in France, in Germany, and other countries to try to disrupt those societies. Here we are on the verge of the next US presidential election in 2024 with Donald Trump possibly being the first convicted felon to run for that office, but he is Russia's hope because he will, partly out of affinity for Putin, partly because he despises the Zelensky government because he failed to blackmail them in 2019 to dish dirt on his rival Joe Biden. He will almost certainly come in and say, we are providing no support for Ukraine. And Russia's counting on that. And Russia's counting on that if the US was to go that course on European countries saying, well, we can't bear the cost without the Americans. So the UK, France, Germany, even diehard supporters of Ukraine like Poland and the Baltic states pulling back. The idea is that you get someone like Viktor Orban within the EU blocking EU assistance to Ukraine. You get Trump blocking it from the United States. And then you hope that other countries like India and China will sort of tilt now back towards you because they see the way the political winds are shifting.
Will Putin personally, though, not see the irony and indeed be humiliated by the fact that for someone who for so long has tried to define himself against America, his fate is now in the hands of American voters, it would seem?
Putin doesn't see himself as being in the hands of American voters. He sees himself being able to, in a sense, contribute to the manipulation of American voters. That's part of the Russian great game. And he certainly doesn't think that he will owe anything to Donald Trump. I mean, all you have to think back to, again, if we want to dig back into history, is go back to the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin uh, after Trump took office, when Trump actually chose Putin over his own intelligence agencies, actually disrespected U.S. intelligence agencies and said, why don't you think Vladimir's telling the truth here? And if you look at the image just after that press conference, where Trump, his shoulders are hunched, his head is bowed, and Putin's beaming, absolutely beaming. So Putin and the inner circle think they can play Trump. And to a large extent, they can. They think they can play the diehard Trumpists and the hard right Republicans who even now are threatening further aid to Ukraine in the U.S. House of Representatives. No, Vladimir Putin, has had a lot of failures with respect to Ukraine. I think he overreached. But in terms of pre-February 2022, this psychological political warfare did have a series of successes, and that's what he's going to reach back to. Again, assuming he's still in charge in Moscow, which I think he will be for the foreseeable future.
How does he view his current position, though, Scott? And does he understand some of those structural weaknesses you've been explaining? I mean, we are still a year out from the US presidential election. A lot can happen in that time. Barely anyone was talking about Yevgeny Prigozhin this time last year, and look at what's happened over the past 12 months. How will he view his position at the moment? Does he appreciate his weakness?
You do not survive within what was then the Soviet system and the Russian system. You do not maintain yourself as the leader of that system for almost a quarter of a century if you don't have quite a lot of will when things get tough, as well as when they're going for you. So, Putin doesn't show signs that he's going to fold. To the contrary, I think we went through what would have been the key phase so far in terms of the post-2022 phase, in terms of the challenge within the Russian system. And you referred to Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the leader of the Wagner group of mercenaries. And for 36 hours in late June of this year, he staged a rebellion. His forces took Rostov-on-Don, which was the city with the Southern Military Command that oversees Ukrainian operations. They walked into that headquarters without firing a shot. Then they began to advance on Moscow. And they were within, a couple of 100 kilometers of Moscow. But then did Putin fold? No, he didn't. Putin struck a deal through the Belarus leader, Alexander Lukashenko, for the rebellion to be ended. And then he bided his time. Wagner was supposed to relocate to Belarus. Prigozhin could have his own little fiefdom there. He bided his time, and 2 months later, he probably, ordered the assassination of Prigozhin. Can't say that it's 100% the case when Prigozhin's jet crashed north of Moscow, but it's plausible. Now look where you are. The fact is that what Yevgeny Prigozhin demanded, and this would have been Putin's capitulation. He said, you've got to replace your defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. You've got to replace the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian operations, General Valery Gerasimov. Shoigu and Gerasimov stayed. And indeed, their profiles have been elevated since that Wagner rebellion. In terms of political opposition, Dmitry Medvedev, himself a former president before Putin. What has Putin done? Putin has stuck him in as deputy head of the he stuck him in as deputy head of the State National Security Council. But Medvedev is basically like Putin's barking dog, very loud barking dog, saying crazy things about the West and how this is all going to lead to nuclear war if you don't give up on Ukraine immediately. Look at others who are around Putin. Key advisors like Nikolai Patrushev, Sergei Kirilenko, and they're not showing any signs of breaking from Putin. They're deploying his political, his psychological strategy, even while the military effort is sagging. So no, I think had the Wagner rebellion continued, had a significant chunk of the Russian military said, look, these guys are on the up, that would have been a turning point for Putin, but he was able to withstand that. And when he did, I think he consolidated himself to the point where what we're now saying is we're on the road to the elections in March 2024, those managed elections, in which you're going to see Putin nominally get another term as president. You'll see all the victory celebrations, and the idea will be that he and Russia continue to stand tall.
So what would your response be, Scott, to those analysts? And there are those, I spoke recently to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry on this programme, saying actually his structural position is far weaker than a lot of people are giving it credit for. And that, yes, okay, you may not see the obvious signs, but it being Russia, you don't see the signs. And then one day the dam will break and there may be an internal attempt to overthrow him. What would your response be to that?
I think, again, when we talk about the long game, yes, there are those structural weaknesses that we're talking about. I mean, there are clearly weaknesses in terms of the way that Russia's fought this war with its military. There's clearly been command and control issues. There have clearly been supply issues. There have clearly been logistics issues. This was, hailed as the second greatest army, the second biggest army going into the Ukraine war in February 2022. And now, as the oft repeated line goes, it's probably the second biggest army inside Ukraine, given its failures. There are clearly tensions within the Russian economy. It has not broken. You have to emphasize it's not broken. But its trade capacity has constricted, its manufacturing capacity has constricted. It is reliant now more than ever on its exports of energy, oil and gas supplies elsewhere. It has been affected in terms of the amount, not just the headlines of Western companies leaving Russia, but in terms of the restrictions on the ability to access financial markets. That will have a long-term effect. It may be facing long-term challenges, not in the center, not in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, but in the further parts of Russia, where you see people start to chafe at this war going on, the fact where they have a number of their men who have been sent to die on the Ukrainian front. So you look at somewhere like Dagestan in the south, where we've seen tensions recently. You look at the eastern republics, but that's long term. That's long term. And the reason why I want to be cautious here with respect to those who do talk about the structural weaknesses is because there is a tendency, again, as we're seeing with the way the military situation is being assessed right now, that it's going to happen soon. It's just around the corner. It's just around the corner. And what happens is when you think that it's all going to collapse just around the corner, just like in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally did collapse, and it doesn't happen, then Russia propaganda crows, still here, still here, look at me, still here. If Russia suffered a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield, if it suffered something similar to the autumn of 2022, where Ukrainian counteroffensive suddenly liberated all of a region, let's say all of the Donetsk region, including moving into Donetsk city, which has been the center of the Russian occupation since 2014 in eastern Ukraine, then yes, a sudden collapse on the battlefield does herald the end not only of Putin, but of the Russian system as we currently know it. But those sudden collapses are not what history is usually made up of. It's not like in World War I where the Germans suddenly, without anyone stepping foot on German territory, said, that's it, we give up. That's the exception rather than the rule. You're talking about a grinding conflict on all fronts.
What do you think keeps Vladimir Putin up at night? What is his biggest fear?
He wouldn't tell you. He wouldn't admit to it. And I'm not sure that I would reach into his head to say that he's going to start off with a fear. I think read Putin not from fear, but from ambition. Read it from ambition where he has succeeded, which is he has stayed at the top of the system. And the Russian system is a ruthless system, as many of Putin's now dead opponents will tell you, as Alexei Navalny, sitting in that prison for possibly more than 30 years, will tell you, as many journalists who have been killed will tell you, it is a ruthless system. It is a system where he does have to keep one eye open, but he's still there.
But I suppose what I'm getting at is if you're Putin and you're looking at the potential threats to you, do you look at the danger of there being another Prigozhin? Now, we spoke recently with Candice Rondeau on this program saying actually there aren't any other equivalent groups like Wagner. People talk about PMC Redoute. It's very different. Are you more worried, for example, about attacks on Crimea by the Ukrainians and the reputational damage that might do to Russia? What are you most concerned about?
This invasion of Ukraine in 2022, he locked down the system in the sense of getting the constitutional changes where he could stay in as president on a legal basis until 2036. He gave power to the state National Security Council, installed Dmitry Medvedev there, both to make that the source of power in the Russian system, but also to control it. He ensured that his party, United Russia, had packed both houses of the Russian parliament so that he could effectively get legislation rubber stamped. He clamped down on media outlets to minimize the chance of resistance. He locked all of that down in advance, right? Then, when things have gone wrong in Ukraine, what he's done is he's calculated in terms of where's my next threat going to come from and where do I move against it. So there's been a series of changes of military commanders. And those military commanders are not just changed because, quote, they have failed. It's because Putin plays divide and rule amongst the commanders, and then he promotes certain favorites. And then if a commander becomes too big for his boots, as it were, as a possible threat, then he gets sidelined. So Putin's now at the point where he's got his guy, Valery Gerasimov, who hasn't been that effective in overseeing the Ukrainian operations, but Putin thinks he's not going to turn against me. He's got a defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, who he thinks is not going to turn against me. He's got Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow. And it's right, okay, Sobyanin's got his patch, but clearly Putin thinks, all right, he's not going to be a guy that's going to rise up and challenge me. I mean, the one time where we might talk about fear rather than calculation. So the time when Putin was caught off guard was the Wagner Rebellion in June of this year. And that is, I don't think he foresaw that Prigozhin was going to make his move at that point, not to get rid of Putin, but Prigozhin, in effect, was setting conditions for Putin, which is you get rid of the defense minister, Shoigu, you get rid of the commander in chief, Gerasimov. And he didn't expect that Prigozhin would back that up with that move of manpower and that move of heavy military equipment, including tanks, on the road to Moscow. But again, if fear set in with Putin, within 36 hours, he had calculated beyond that, which is probably looking over his shoulder and seeing that most of the Russian military hadn't broken from him yet, I'm going to reach a deal with Prigozhin. Why Prigozhin accepted that deal, that is another area we go into. But the fact is, he did. And when he did, then Putin moves back from fear into calculation. I've got this guy now who has ended his rebellion, who's going to move his fighters to Belarus. He himself has said he'll go to Belarus, and Putin's got himself the breathing space, and he used that breathing space ruthlessly and effectively. I can't see another Prigozhin. What has happened with the private military companies has been notable since this summer, and that is there have been new private military companies that have been developed, such as Redout. They now are taking on some of the former Wagner fighters. They're now getting some of the resources. Uh, the Chechen groups under Ramzan Kadyrov are, being hailed as, again, reliable and may take on some of the Wagner assets. Uh, and that means that not only does Putin safeguard his position, importantly, he safeguards Russia's position in terms of the holdings that it has in the Middle East and in Africa. That's the type of calculation I'm talking about. There are others who could probably talk to you about Ramzan Kadyrov, who is a guy with a huge ego, who has built up his own profile, let's say, as being a warlord, which he is in Chechnya, but he's Putin's warlord at this point. Uh, he got to power from Putin being ruthless in suppressing the insurgency in Chechnya, killing again before Ukraine. Russia carried out massive war crimes there, killing tens of thousands uh, of people, causing hundreds of thousands of casualties. Could Kadyrov turn against Russia? I don't think so. I think Putin thinks he's got him where he wants, and Kadyrov is going to, for the sake of his own little space, his fiefdom, continue to serve the master in the Kremlin, unless there is a sudden turn, in terms of the military situation or a sudden collapse of the Russian economy. I don't think you have the conditions where the political advisors inside the Kremlin, Sergei Kirilenko, Nikolai Patrushev, link up with the business community, the oligarchy, who in turn link up with elements of the security forces to provide the alliance that would be needed as the precondition to start to bring Putin down, even if that alliance was established between advisors, oligarchs, and parts of the military. I don't think it would necessarily be a move to get rid of Putin, but to set conditions on Putin. In other words, you've got to make the shift. So if I was gaming this out, rather than say, will Putin fall? Will there be a change in the Russian environment where there'll be pressure on him to negotiate a way out of the Ukrainian predicament? Because right now, even as the Kremlin screams, Ukraine won't negotiate, the West won't negotiate, that's not the fundamental here. The fundamental here is Vladimir Putin won't negotiate, because if he negotiates, he admits he's lost.
And that, I suppose, brings us nicely back to your original point, Scott, which is that actually his underlying position is a lot weaker than some people appreciate, and that the war is not really at a stalemate, but that Russia aren't making the progress they'd have hoped to make. So would you say that maybe Putin, his objective now is just to stay in power? Victory for him now is staying in power and maintaining his position, whereas 18 months ago, his objective was a military objective in Ukraine.
I think the starting point is Vladimir Putin stays in power and continues to, lock down the Russian space. Remember, he locks down that Russian space not just for political power, but for economic power. It's been extremely profitable for Vladimir Putin to lead Russia in terms of his own personal holdings. It's been extremely profitable for those who have survived and are still around Putin in terms of their own holdings. And they continue to hold much of that despite the Western sanctions. So you continue to hold on to that. You continue to hold on to what Mark Galeotti's called late Putinism, right? Which is, as again, to lift with a tribute to Mark, the kleptocracy continues to be kleptocrats. But beyond that, no, I think Putin still wants to hold on to part of Ukraine in the sense of calling it Russia. When he annexed those four regions in September of 2022, he was acknowledging, okay, I've implicitly acknowledging, not openly, like I failed to take Kyiv. But he was trying to turn that into, but look, Crimea and these four regions, they're part of this new greater Russia. The billboards went up, the ceremonies were held. Now, it is a Pyrrhic victory if you've looked at the destruction in Melitopol or Mariupol, or even now the Ukrainian attacks that are taking place on Russian positions in Crimea. So it's a Pyrrhic victory, but it's his Pyrrhic victory. It's what's left of that legacy he's going to try to claim. And I think he's going to try to hold on to it. And then I think Putin's going to try one other thing. And again, this is the risk. Because the wider war for Vladimir Putin was with the West. He still believes ideologically that he can triumph against the West by turning the West against itself, by turning the international community against itself. He still believes he can win in the US. He still believes he can win in the UK by causing discord here. And who's to say that the UK, which hasn't had its share of discord in the last 7 years, isn't giving him some window of hope? He'll continue to think that he can play and support, for example, the far right to cause trouble in France, or the far right to cause trouble in Germany, or that he can use the threat of refugees to elevate the issue of immigration to divide the West. In other words, that psychological warfare continues. So Vladimir Putin's biggest threat now is not on the Ukrainian battlefield. It's in our own spaces. It's in our own spaces because any opening, whether it's talk of defeat or talk of division, he will try to turn his weakness into an advantage by exploiting, well, our own challenges.
Scott, always fascinating to get your insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James. Thanks to all of your crew. Thanks to all your great viewers.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.